Believe it or not, Lighter may be the most unique character ZenlessZoneZero has ever released, but it's not for the reason you're thinking of. Before I break down why, understand that Lighter is much different than your average stunner, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. He's got plenty of stun potential if you can build up his special resource known as morale, and the ice plus fire buffs that he gives to his team are absolutely ridiculous. But unlike typical dazers, he actually wants to spend a decent amount of time off field. Yes, you're hearing that right. A stunner who doesn't want to take the field 24/7. This makes his playstyle and game plan a bit confusing, but don't worry, today I'll be explaining everything you need to know about Lighter. But before I do so, remember that the footage from this video will be from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change. And as always, this is a first impressions video where things can change before the banner release date. But enough stalling, let's get into it. Lighter is by far the most unique dazer that we have. Despite having the role of a stunner, he actually plays quite similar to a damage dealer. He has a huge reliance on his allies to spend their energy so he can gain morale, but once he gains a certain amount of morale, he unleashes a series of attacks that buff the team greatly while also debuffing enemies. This is not to be underestimated because this does contribute to an insane amount of damage added to the team, but the overall playstyle of waiting for energy, swapping via defensive assist once a certain morale threshold is reached, and then buffing the entire team feels very suited for team compositions with greedy on-field DPS. In order to understand how to better use his kit, however, let's break down what it has to offer, starting with his core passive. Truthfully, the description for these skills and even Lighter's core passive is something that I've never seen before. It is over 250 words long and can seem very intimidating or difficult to understand, but in reality, it's actually quite simple, but just long simply because of how it works. Let's start with Lighter's unique resource, morale. He generates morale at a rate of 2.9 per second, and whenever a squad mate uses energy, Lighter gains morale up to a maximum of 100. When Lighter reaches the 80 morale threshold, the next time he swaps in, he performs a quick assist. Additionally, using the 5th hit of his basic attack sends Lighter into the morale burst state. Now, before we get to the other buffs, here's a summary of what you need to know about using the core passive. Being at high morale and swapping over to Lighter will be your goal. This enhances both Lighter's stun potential, but also buffs the entire rest of the team too. And now, let's get back to the kit description. It's not that complicated. Being in the morale burst state, however, increases the damage and daze of his abilities while striking, but this does cost morale while performing it. As his morale is being drained, however, he gains impact up to a maximum of 20% that lasts 6 seconds. Performing startup light punches or jab combos also decreases the target's ice and fire resistance by 15% for 30 seconds, and this is amazing since you won't need to constantly swap back and forth to keep it applied. The final buff, or technically debuff, that Lighter applies via his core passive is Collapse. In the morale burst state, when Lighter's finishing move hits an enemy, it applies the collapse effect on the target, which extends its stun duration by 3 seconds. This is a lot of buffing, honestly, for just one skill, and I'll say it, it's incredible how much they crammed into one single ability. But now there are some things that you'll want to know about his morale burst state before you actually start playing him, and the first is that in said state, Lighter will no longer gain morale over time. The second is that if his morale is exhausted during a startup light punch or jab combo, he will instead automatically follow up with a more powerful finishing move. And finally, the last thing you should know is that the collapse effect that increases stun duration is only applicable once per enemy before recovering from stun. This is basically so that you don't infinitely knock out the enemy and they can't move. Good call. The core passive was honestly a lot, but Lighter's additional ability is way shorter and much easier to understand. To start, this skill activates so long as you have an attack or a Sons of Caledon agent on your team, and when its requirements are met, this ability further buffs Lighter during his morale burst state. However, rather than buffing himself during this, he actually provides his team with a new buff called Elation. Elation stacks up to 20 times and lasts 30 seconds, and each stack increases an agent's ice and fire damage by 1.25%. At base, this means he will offer allies a 25% increase to these two elements, but if Lighter's impact exceeds 170, every 10 additional points will increase the buff effect per stack by an additional 0.25%. Furthermore, anyone that launches a chain attack will also refresh the duration of Elation on the team, and this additional buff can increase the damage boost from Elation by a maximum of 75%. So to summarize what you gain from both his core passive and additional ability, so long as you play him as intended, you receive an insane amount of element damage with a bottom line of 25% base. You also gain 15% fire and ice shred, and finally 3 additional seconds of stun in addition to the boost to his own personal stun rate. If this sounds like a lot, it is, and this actually starts to make Lighter feel more like a support than a dazer, especially because of his reliance on energy and his otherwise mediocre basic attacks. On that note, let's actually talk about Lighter's basic attacks. Lighter has a 5-part basic attack combo combo that can actually be held down instead of pressed. This is unlike most other characters who are forced to continuously press their inputs, but this generates daze just like everyone else. What does make this ability truly special, however, is what happens when you have morale and perform the fifth part of his basic attack combo. We already addressed the strength of the buffs that you gain when you use the fifth part of his basic attack combo in the additional section before, but something also worth mentioning here is that Lighter's early basic attacks don't apply nearly as much daze as his fifth hit or his finishing move do, and that's actually a huge reason as to why Lighter prefers being off field or bypassing his early basic attacks through other means. On the topic of skipping moves, let's actually talk about special attacks, which do grant him the ability to skip over his basic attacks. By themselves, Lighter's EX special attacks are a two-part combo similar to that of Qingyi, with a first EX special that can be used to uppercut and a follow-up EX special that can then be used to smash into the ground. Both of these hits are powerful and apply a lot of daze, but the second cast only costs 20 energy to activate. By comparison, the first cast of Lighter's EX special costs 40. Lighter in total has access to 120 energy, and this means that activating 4 EX special attacks should be possible if you time up his energy generation properly. But that's not what's important about this attack. Instead, one of the best parts about Lighter's EX special attack is the fact that it grants him the ability to skip to the fourth part of his basic attack after casting. Now I know this sounds like the end of the skill, but there's actually even more. If you perform a sidestep dodge, you can activate an enhanced quick jab that also applies daze that provides you with an even better skip. Unlike the uppercut or smash into the ground, this new EX special attack allows you to begin his attack combo from the fifth part of his basic as opposed to his fourth. This is of course better for Lighter since he can then skip the fourth basic attack and begin his endless jab combo immediately after performing this EX special. Now you could argue that Lighter's dodge is less useful than normal since he doesn't like being on field for nearly as long, but when he is on field, the skill does add value to his kit. Aside from granting him access to an alternative EX special, his dodge abilities grant him other skips like with his dodge counter. When performing a dodge counter, Lighter is also able to skip ahead to the fifth part of his basic attack, and this is why his dodge skills are so valuable. Getting to this fifth part is absolutely vital for playing Lighter properly, and it's clear just how important this is based on how many different skills allow you the ability to skip to this fifth hit. Lighter's assists are nothing special, however you will be using them frequently since using an assist follow-up also grants you the same basic attack skip that we've mentioned throughout this kit. Additionally, as we mentioned earlier, when you have at least 80 morale, Lighter will automatically perform a quick assist the next time that you swap him in, and this does contribute a bit to his overall daze. Side note though, from the testing that I had with Lighter, I found that defensive assisting Lighter onto field was one of the better, more smooth transitions in order to achieve his buffs before inevitably swapping off field to another agent. Lighter's chain attack is pretty normal for Stunner's standards, but it is pretty long, so using this ability might not always be worth it. This is especially true if you're pairing Lighter with someone like Ellen and Sokaku, since both of these characters already have decently long chain attacks, but if you do want to refresh elation stacks, you are going to have to use chain attacks on some character, so keep that in mind when making that decision. Lighter's ultimate is pretty forgettable since, well, it's yet another damage skill on a non-damage character, but in case you were curious, I did actually perform a few runs with Lighter as a damage dealer, and he did end up doing a few 100,000 damage here and there against stunned enemies. I really don't recommend doing this though. Lighter's build choice is not actually as straightforward as it might sound, and in this case, he has 3 potential 4-piece set options, with the 2-piece option really being non-negotiable. Let's start off with the 4-piece sets. Protopunk might sound like a weird option here since he doesn't have shields, but the amount of defensive assists that Lighter performs in his team compositions definitely makes up for this. The added damage increase and the amount of time he spends off field certainly justifies trying this option, but based on the results that we've seen from testing, this setup actually outperforms most if not all other sets, unless if we're comparing it to our next set. Freedom Blues is another fantastic option, but as with the set's passive, it is dependent on the main DPS's element and what your goal with Lighter is. If used with someone like Ellen and Sokaku, Freedom Blues has much less value on Lighter compared to Protopunk or any other set. However, if Freedom Blues on Lighter is paired with an agent like Soldier or Bernice, it actually ends up outperforming its competitor by a decent amount. Now there is one set that you've likely expected me to talk about first, but I haven't mentioned yet, and that's Shockstar Disco. Although Stunners in almost every single scenario gains the most value from a set that increases daze or impact, the unique behavior and playstyle of Lighter actually makes the set less powerful. Being able to inflict 20% more daze is valuable, but based on early testing for Lighter, it's much less common for him to use basics, dash attacks, or dodge counters compared to other daze agents. This isn't to say that the set is unusable on him, but the amount of daze that he applies from defensive assists and EX special attacks is actually significant enough to tip things in other sets' favors. Now for his 2-piece set, Shockstar Disco is definitely still the best choice, assuming you aren't running 4-piece Shockstar Disco, but in case case you are, using any combination of Swing Jazz, Freedom Blues, or Chaos Jazz as a 2-piece set is also fine too. My recommendation for sets on lighter is therefore 4-piece Freedom Blues if running lighter with another fire agent, but otherwise using 4-piece Protopunk for the amount of assisting that he does on field. The 2-piece set, as I mentioned, should definitely still be Shockstar, as we'll see with stats later, but overall the performance of these two is mostly dependent on team composition and how the stats on these discs rolled. Stat-wise, lighter can alternate between an anomaly based and a supportive crit build, so let's take a look at the main stats for each. Anomaly build-wise, a 4th slot anomaly proficiency disc, a 5th slot fire or attack percent disc, and impact as the 6th slot is going to round out your build. And for crit, the only difference here is a crit damage or a 4th slot disc instead, and otherwise the same choices of 5th slot attack and fire, with 6th slot impact remaining the same. Substat wise for the anomaly build, looking for attack percent anomaly proficiency is your goal, with at least 1 or 2 rolls of either stat on the pieces that you choose to wear on your lighter. But for crit, maintaining at least 50 crit rate and as much crit damage as possible will yield the best results. Attack percent on the crit build does matter for the sake of dealing more damage, but ultimately the damage contribution of stunners and supportive characters compared to main DPS has shown that these additional damage stats on supports are much less important than people think. Side note, anomaly lighter may gain a slight advantage over crit lighter because any amount of anomaly that lighter builds will mitigate how much he dilutes the overall anomaly damage dealt by him and by allies. Long story short, they both deal mediocre damage, but preventing yourself from lowering another agent's damage is always going to be better value, especially if you're pairing him with primarily anomaly agents. Lighter's W engine is actually pretty interesting as he has a variety of options to choose from, but to start things off, his signature is his best choice, no questions asked. It provides an insane amount of damage for his team while also providing the best overall days on a W engine. To be honest, the ice damage and fire damage alone truly makes this a fantastic option, especially for agents who don't already have a lot of damage bonuses in their kit, but even if they do, adjustments can be made to increase the value of Blazing Laurel, like with Ellen and running something like Brimstone as her W engine instead of taking her own. To return back to Lighter's W engine choices, Blazing Laurel and Ice Jade Teapot, which is Chingy's signature W engine, have pulled out ahead in performance and actually buffing the team's damage. If these two aren't available, however, Fossilized Core is by far the best free-to-play option he has, with the first stun provided through this W engine providing much more value than every other stun following it. Calculations done on the standard banner S-rank W engines have also shown these to be decent, but they aren't as powerful as the two limiteds, which of course makes sense. In regards to whether pulling for his signature W engine is worthwhile, I do have the following for you to consider. This W engine is amazing for dazing faster, increasing 2 element specific damage, and it also has its passive activate based off of basic attacks. In my eyes, a dual element W engine that can be used on future units is certainly appealing, but it does also leave room for Hoyoverse to maybe release a similar concept in the future. Personally, if I were someone that already had Chingy's Jade Teapot, this might be a W engine that I would skip over, but if you're someone who loves crit based fire or ice units, this is definitely worth picking up. That being said, early tests for his Mindscape 1 have actually shown to outperform his signature W engine, so do with this information what you will. Before we move to team compositions, I do want to talk about impact and the additional ability that Lighter has. If you recall, Lighter can increase the Elation stack's buff value when his additional ability is active, but this is dependent on his impact stat. Assuming Lighter is at least equipped with 2-piece Shockstar Disco and has an impact 6-slot disk drive, the question then is, what W engine can actually reach the maximum impact needed to gain the 75% value? Well, there are actually 3 W engines that will allow you to hit 270 impact, which is the amount needed to cap out on this value. The first is her signature, Blazing Laurel. The second is Ice Jade Teapot, Chingy's signature. And finally, Hellfire Gears, assuming you can maintain 2 stacks of its passive. Now again, this damage bonus may not nearly be as insane as it sounds, especially if you're pairing this W engine with characters with innate damage bonuses already, but it is worth looking into impact stats as reasons why certain W engines may actually outperform others. This could be the case for Hellfire Gears, assuming that you get 2 stacks of it, but special disclaimer here, the calculations done right before is assuming that these are S-rank W engines at rank 1 without multiple copies. Let's talk teams now. There are 2 teams that I tested with Lighter that I was curious about and interested in seeing performance-wise, and these were Ellen Lighter Sukaku and Bernice Lighter Yanagi. Ellen Lighter Sukaku was the team that I was most curious about since Ellen and Lycone have been stuck together since 1.0, and this led me to test out many variations of Ellen and Lighter together, but then came the issue with this team. Ellen's additional ability only synergizes with ice agents or members of Victoria House housekeeping. And given that her additional ability is a major boost to her DPS, this meant that pairing Ellen with someone like Lighter and also someone like Caesar was completely off the table. This is honestly a major loss for Lighter's potential, since the best feeling and typically best performing team compositions have Caesar in them. However, for the Ellen Lighter Sokaku team, I did actually spend a lot of time testing and clearing content with this team composition. And I have to say, if you didn't need the barrier from Caesar, this team does still clear insanely fast. The energy building minigame that Lighter has in his kit synergizes very well with Sokaku, who definitely also uses her EX special attack to generate vortex stacks regularly. But this isn't even the best part. Ellen, as the main damage dealer for this team composition, also provides Lighter with an on-field DPS who can dish out decent damage even without needing to rely exclusively on energy. Now let's talk about Bernice, Yanagi, Lighter. And I'll be the brave one to say it. Anything plus Bernice and Yanagi is going to be broken, and Lighter, of course, is no exception. The only real issue that I found with this team is that finding footage for this team composition is difficult when everything literally dies in 2 seconds. But yes, the fire and ice damage is wasted for Yanagi in this team composition, but the additional damage increase for Bernice alongside the fire shred and of course the additional time for Yanagi to attack stun enemies makes every single boss that I fight with this team composition die in under a minute. Despite the love that I have for this team though, it is still worth mentioning that the loss of Caesar's protection or Lucy's attack increase is pretty noticeable, but especially for the critical nodes of Shield defense, this didn't matter nearly as much as everything blew up in the first stun or soon after. Finally, let's talk about pulling for Lighter. This is a tough one. Lighter is honestly a character who embodies so much of the cool guys don't look at explosions mentality, and therefore I'm very biased towards pulling for this cool new agent. However, he does actually lack a perfect pairing at the moment, as characters like Soldier 11 don't necessarily feel better to play than Yanagi, Bernice, or even an Ellen team with Lighter specifically. This is also why I struggle with recommending Lighter specifically, as it feels as though his best pairing is yet to arrive. If a future crit-based ice or fire limited agent is released, I could definitely see Lighter gaining insane value based on his kit, but as of this moment, Kaleda or Lycone based teams will see similar results, if not only slightly worse performances. To be fair, this is not so much an issue of Lighter having a bad kit, but instead the fact that Soldier can sometimes just feel worse to play with other attack agents, and of course the fact that Ellen loves playing with Caesar, but Lighter can't fit in a team with the two of them present at the same time. Ultimately, I'll still be pulling for him since I really love the goofiness of this character, but I understand if you don't want to, feel free to pull with whatever criteria you see fit. That's going to be it for this video though, guys. Thank you again for watching. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. I hope you guys learned or gained a little bit out of this video, and as always, thank you again for supporting all my content. If you'd like, feel free to check out the rest of my socials if you want to see more content from me as always. But thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.